In our headlines on this Friday afternoon, December 29th, here in South Korea. Consumer prices averaged 3.6% this year on the back of higher utility bills, and authorities here reiterate plans to bring prices down to the 2% range in the year ahead. Speaking to a local media outlet, the U.S. State Department brushes aside claims of hostile intent towards North Korea as alleged by its leader Kim Jong-un, and instead reaffirms its commitment to dialogue. Video footage being shared online shows at least 2 boys, among other Palestinian men in their underwear, lined up in single files in a football field under the watch of Israeli soldiers. Korea's inflation averaged 3.6% this year, largely on the back of more expensive utility bills. Our Lee Soo-jin starts us off.
South Korea's consumers were hit with higher prices this year. Data from Statistics Korea on Friday shows that in 2023, consumer prices, a key gauge of inflation, rose 3.6% compared to the previous year. While the increase was less than that of 2022, when consumer prices grew at the fastest pace in more than 2 decades following the outbreak of war in Ukraine, it was still high compared to before the COVID-19 pandemic, when consumer prices rose less than 1% in 2019 and in the 1% to 2% range from 2016 to 2018. Statistics Korea mostly attributed the high prices this year to soaring energy prices and unstable weather patterns. Electricity, gas, and water prices jumped a whopping 20% compared to a year earlier on electricity and gas rate hikes, the largest rise on record. Prices of agriculture and fisheries products also rose by 3.1% this year, mostly due to the high prices of fruits from the poor weather seen in the summer and fall. The stats agency, however, emphasized that other sectors saw an easing of price pressures.
With the exception of electricity, gas and water prices, overall the rising consumer prices greatly slowed compared to 2022, and this was mainly due to the drop in oil prices compared to last year.
Industrial products were up 2.6%, and prices in the service sector rose by more than 3% this year. For the month of December, the on-year rise in consumer prices was similar to that of the previous month, going up 3.2%. That's the 5th consecutive month that consumer prices saw an on-year increase of more than 3%. The Bank of Korea on Friday said that while inflation is expected to show signs of easing in the new year, the central bank will maintain a tight policy until the rise in consumer prices slows to its target rate of 2%. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
Indeed, the importance of reining in inflation was also touched upon by Finance Minister Choi Sang-mok earlier on this Friday. During an emergency economic meeting to share the government's related policies for next year, he stressed the significance of reviving livelihoods. In fact, ensuring the cost of living is among the 4 economic priorities for 2024 that also include tackling potential risk factors, creating a dynamic market environment, and framing out productive policies for future generations. The details to these ends will be made public next week. And the Korean economy saw its fair share of ups and downs this year, and our business correspondent Shin Ha-young covers some of those moments through their defining numbers. Do take a listen.
For South Korea, the year 2023 was not easy on the economic front, but at the same time, it was a year where the country witnessed some positive signs. The first key number is 2%. It's the Bank of Korea's target level of inflation, and as widely expected, one of the economic keywords of 2023 was, of course, inflationary pressure. The Consumer Price Index, a key gauge of inflation, shows signs of slowing in the first half of 2023, with the on-year inflation rate dipping as low as 2.3% in July. But in the following months, inflation increased to 3% level due to higher oil costs and rising prices for some agricultural goods. In efforts to bring inflation down to its target level, South Korea's central bank kept the key interest rate unchanged at 3.5% for its 7th straight meeting. Meanwhile, the U.S. Fed has maintained its rate in the 5.25% to 5.5% range for a 3rd consecutive time. With the Fed hinting at rate cuts for 2024, market watchers also expect possible rate cuts from the Bank of Korea. The key interest rate gap between South Korea and the U.S., which stands at 2 percentage points, will continue to be a factor to keep our eyes on in 2024 based on the monetary policy directions of the two countries. The second key figure is 13 months. South Korea's economic backbone, its exports, have been sluggish amid continued weak global demand for semiconductor chips, as well as a relatively slow reopening in China. However, toward the end of 2023, exports began showing some promising signs. Korea's exports in October saw an on-year rebound for the first time in 13 months thanks to greater shipments of automobiles and ships. Exports in November remained robust due to a rebound in semiconductor exports after 16 months, along with a rebound in rechargeable batteries and petrochemicals. And even though exports to China continued to decline for the 18th consecutive month, the overall trade balance as of November maintained a surplus for the 6th straight months. The last key figure is 1.4%. With such performances, the OECD, International Monetary Fund, Bank of Korea, and the South Korean government all forecast economic growth for 2023 at 1.4%, while the Asian Development Bank predicts growth of 1.3%. Then what will the South Korean economy look like in 2024? The general consensus among economic pundits is that the country's economy will expand by over 2% in 2024. The estimated figure from the OECD has been revised up to 2.3% from its previous report, with exports likely to pick up with a recovery in chip demand. However, there are various factors that Korea needs to focus on from both at home and from abroad. Key external uncertainties include financial instability due to global inflation and sustained lingering high key interest rates and geopolitical tensions arising from conflicts like the Israel-Hamas war and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Additionally, concerns involve a deepening economic downturn in China, as well as the pace of recovery in the global chip industry. On the domestic front, high levels of household debt could continue to weigh on private consumption and investment. But hopefully, the nation's strong resilience and the positive signals in 2023 will pave the way for a tangible economic recovery in 2024.
The U.S. State Department has responded to North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's recent claims for war preparations amid his claims of American hostility. Our North Korean affairs correspondent Kim Jong-sil reports.
The U.S. has made it clear that it has no hostile intent toward Pyongyang and remains committed to diplomacy. This is according to Yonhap News Agency on Friday in its Q&A with a U.S. State Department spokesperson. The official stressed that the U.S. seeks dialogue with Pyongyang without preconditions, even as the North has launched an unprecedented number of ballistic missiles. The U.S. official's comment comes after North Korean leader Kim Jong-un made orders on Wednesday to beef up the regime's war preparations. According to the North State-run Korean Central News Agency, during the year-end plenary session of the Central Committee of the North's ruling Workers' Party, Kim set forth the tasks to, quote, further accelerate war preparations, saying the U.S. is engaged in unprecedented acts of confrontation against the regime. Meanwhile, a U.S. expert on North Korea reiterated that Washington must shift its policy focus from denuclearization to arms control and reduction. Yoon-suk Lee, a former deputy assistant director of the Korea Mission Center at the CIA, recently wrote on the Foreign Policy Research Institute's website that the first step to this process is to, quote, politically accept North Korea's de facto status as a nuclear weapons state. Meanwhile, the South Korean National Intelligence Service said North Korea is highly likely to engage in provocative actions at the beginning of the year ahead of South Korea's general election in April and the U.S. presidential election in November. In a press release on Thursday, the NIS vowed to make efforts to establish early warning and preparedness systems with relevant ministries. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, in North Korea, Kim Jong-un has reportedly urged for innovation in the production of school supplies such as bags as well as uniforms and shoes. According to the regime's state-run media on this Friday, the remarks were made during Thursday's session of a key policy meeting that began earlier this week. Now, Kim has called for a stronger sense of responsibility from North Korea's light industry with regard to the production of necessities for students. Pundits believe the latest calls for youth welfare seeks to create an image of a caring leader. The session also reviewed next year's budget, which will reportedly be confirmed by the regime's parliament on January 15th. And back south of the border, the Yoon administration is looking to usher in its third year in office next year. And ahead of this event, reshuffling of key posts continue, especially with regard to broader security and related policy. Our correspondent Kim Do-yeon has details.
New names for all three of President Yoon Suk-yeol's highest-ranking aides were announced on Thursday. First, the current First Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chang Ho-jin, has been named the new National Security Advisor. He's a career diplomat who also was the ambassador to Russia before his latest position.
Security today extends beyond self-national defense to vital diplomatic relations with allies in other countries. The new National Security Advisor, we believe, is ideally suited to support the president in these crucial areas of diplomacy and security.
The appointment comes as the current National Security Advisor, Cho Tae-yong, is going through the parliamentary hearing process to take the vacant position of National Intelligence Service Chief. Chang said he's looking to continue pushing on from the diplomatic and security strategy of the administration, including strengthening cooperation with the U.S. and the new Indo-Pacific strategy.
In the 30 years since the end of the Cold War, the international order has reached a new phase with emerging geopolitical shifts. Assuming this responsibility during such a transitional period makes me feel an even greater sense of duty.
He also emphasized building on the audacious initiative that President Yoon laid out for his policy towards North Korea and other security issues. The current ambassador to Germany, Kim Jong-un, will replace Chang as the first vice minister. Kim is a known expert on North Korean issues with a stint as a special representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, also known as the top nuclear envoy. In the meantime, the current presidential chief of staff, Kim Dae-gi, announced his resignation, saying President Yoon has named his current director of national policy, Lee Kwan-sub, to take the role effective January 1st. The new appointment came less than a month after a reshuffle that created the new Director of National Policy role. Lee was the first one to fill the post. He's a career public servant with known expertise in nuclear energy policy.
People's livelihoods are extremely challenging and macroeconomic risks still remain. I will work diligently. Please continue to encourage, support, and also critique me.
Replacing Lee as the Director of National Policy is an outsider. Song Tae-yoon, a professor of economics at Yonsei University, has been named. The top office says different economy-related government branches have long been asking for his insights, giving him experience both in theory and practice. Kim Do-yeon, Arirang News.
In other news, Korea's top court has placed its weight yet again behind Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor and called on a third Japanese company to pay compensation. Our foreign affairs correspondent Bae Eun-ji has more.
In September 1944, Mr. Hong and others were taken to Mitsubishi Heavy Industries' munitions factory in Hiroshima and were forced to work in harsh conditions before returning home, after the atomic bombing in the area in August the following year. Since then, they not only endure social and economic difficulties, but also suffer from health issues after being exposed to radiation. In 2013, Mr. Hong, along with other surviving victims and families of the late victims, filed a suit against the Japanese company, demanding compensation of 100 million Korean won, or about $77,000 per person. Another victim of forced labor, Mr. Lee, also filed a suit against a Japanese company called Hitachi Josen in 2015. Lee worked at the firm's shipyard from September 1944. South Korea's Supreme Court on Thursday ruled in favor of these two cases, ordering Mitsubishi and Hitachi to pay between 50 million to 150 million Korean won to each victim. That's about 38,000 to 111,000 US dollars. Thursday's rulings are the second by the top court since 2018, when it made landmark rulings on separate forced labor cases, ordering two Japanese companies to compensate Korean victims, which strained diplomatic relations between Seoul and Tokyo. The top court upheld similar rulings last week, ordering Mitsubishi Heavy Industries and Nippon Steel to pay a maximum of 150 million won, or around 115,000 US dollars to each victim in compensation. But the Japanese companies are likely to continue refusing to pay, and the Korean government is expected to compensate the victims instead, using funds procured through a public foundation. The plan was announced earlier this year to improve relations with Japan.
In line with the government compensation plan announced in March, we plan to pay the compensation and damages for the delay through the Foundation for Victims of Forced Mobilization by Imperial Japan.
With such a plan already in place and taking into account Japan's continued denial, it's unlikely that the Japanese firms will pay the compensation themselves. Japanese companies have yet to pay the previously ordered compensation, claiming the statute of limitations for the cases has expired. But last week, for the very first time, the court clarified that this would not be allowed. Peunji, Arirang News.
Over in the Middle East, fresh concerns over human rights violations have been raised amid the spread of footage online of at least two Palestinian boys stripped and detained by Israeli soldiers in a football field. Our Ising-jae has the latest.
A video has surfaced on social media showing Palestinian men and at least two children detained and stripped by the Israeli military in a stadium in northern Gaza. The video appears to show two young boys stripped down to their underwear, walking and holding both their hands up as the Israel Defense Forces soldiers give instructions. Later in the video, it also shows adult male detainees stripped down to their underwear, sitting on the ground with their hands tied to their backs, some blindfolded, while soldiers inspect them. While Israel has not commented directly on the video, it has said in the past that it has stripped detainees to ensure they were not carrying explosives. The IDF has detained hundreds of men and boys in recent weeks. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu canceled a war cabinet meeting set to be held Thursday evening to discuss Israel's plans for who will govern Gaza after the armed conflict. The announcement also comes as Israel's far-right religious Zionism party said it was holding its own faction meeting to protest its exclusion from the post-war discussions. Netanyahu has previously argued against the Palestinian Authority taking control of Gaza after the armed conflict. Conflict continues on the border between Israel and Lebanon as the Israeli military on Thursday shelled Hezbollah infrastructure using aircraft and tanks. This was a response to Hezbollah's attack the previous day on the northern part of Israel, bordering Lebanon, using rockets and drones. Since the armed conflict began in October, it's estimated that about 150 Hezbollah militants have been killed in Lebanon. The Iran-backed militant group vowed to double its attacks if Israel continues to escalate the conflict. Ising-jae, Arirang News.
Elsewhere, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy says he has addressed with Pope Francis plans to put into practice a peace formula to end the violence in Ukraine amid Russian invasion. According to President Zelenskyy, the peace formula includes discussions with over 80 countries at a representative level, and more nations are poised to join. He first proposed the 10-point peace plan during the G20 summit in Indonesia back in November. Now, during talks on Thursday, President Zelenskyy also thanked the Pope for his Christmas greeting to Ukraine and his message for peace. Meanwhile, in his New Year's message earlier on Thursday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres voiced hopes for unity, now pointing out that 2023 had been a year of enormous suffering, violence and climate chaos. He added that wars were growing in frequency and ferocity, while trust was in short supply. He went on to assert that pointing fingers and pointing guns lead nowhere, and instead urged for efforts to rebuild trust and restore hope. He also pledged the UN's role to achieving this broader goal.
Let's take a look at the latest news in the world now. The US Census Bureau figures released on Thursday said that the global population has exceeded the 8 billion mark. The Bureau said the world's population grew by 75 million people over the past year, while the United Nations estimated that the 8 billion threshold was passed in November 2022, announcing November 22nd as the day of 8 billion. The US Census Bureau suggested that the 8 billion mark was passed only in September this year. It explains that the discrepancy is due to countries with large populations such as India and Nigeria not having conducted censuses in over a decade. However, fertility rates are falling around the world and the global population is getting older, with the world median age now at 32 and expected to hit 39 in 2060. The latest data from the Gun Violence Archive on Wednesday said that gun-related incidents have resulted in over 42,400 deaths and almost 36,000 injuries in the US so far in 2023. The non-profit said over 1,600 of the victims were minors under 17 years of age. It also said that around 650 mass shootings took place across the US this year. Data showed that over half of the deaths were acts of suicide, with an average of 66 gun-related suicides per day. Former US Senator, co-founder of Kohl's department store chain, and former owner of NBA's Milwaukee Bucks, Herbert Kohl, died on Wednesday, aged 88. Kohl's death was announced by Herb Kohl Philanthropies, which stated that he died after a brief illness. Kohl was a Wisconsin Democrat who served in the US Senate for 24 years. He was also a known philanthropist, donating millions for education in Wisconsin. An avid basketball fan, Kohl purchased his home team, the Milwaukee Bucks, back in 1985 for $18 million. Kohl sold the Bucks in 2014, after which he donated $100 million for the team's new home arena. In the US, stores in the state of California with more than 500 employees will face fines from January 1st if they do not have a gender-neutral toy section, as the new state law. The Assembly Act 1084, signed by Democrat Governor Gavin Newsom in 2021, comes into force on January 1st and means that stores that sell childcare items or toys will be subjected to a maximum $500 fine if they fail to create a gender-neutral toy section for kids 12 years old and under. Kim Jong-un, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. The last workday of 2023 looks to be a dusty one. For today, mainly southern provinces will see high levels of dust, with a dust advisory being in place for Chungcheongnam-do province. Afternoon temperatures should be as mild as yesterday under cloudier skies with the dust, and Busan and Jeju see highs of 11 degrees Celsius this afternoon. With only days left until the new year, many will be heading to the East Coast to see the last sunset and first sunrise of the year. But with a mix of rain and snow in the forecast for most parts this weekend, we won't be able to see the last sunset clearly, but there is a better chance of checking out the first sunrise. Mountainous regions, however, could see heavy snow on New Year's weekend, so please bear that in mind if you are planning on a New Year's sunrise hike. Meanwhile, the precipitation will wash away the dust in the air. The first week of 2024 starts on a warmer note. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
And those are the top stories at this hour here in Korea. Coming up next is our daily panel session, so do stay with us. Thank you for now.